One of the things that I've been doing for the past 15 years of therapy is that every time I terminate with a client,
Hmm.
we do a practice called appreciations, hopes, and regrets.
Huh.
And the regret part is the most powerful part of the termination, in part because I get to hear my clients' regrets, and it's sort of a launching point for what they're going to work on next. Therapy's not over because you're done with therapy. It actually is that now you get to go continue to do this work. But then also it's made me a better therapist, because a client may say, I regret I didn't talk to you about my drinking earlier. And then I may say something back like, I regret not asking you about your drinking earlier when I suspected it. So it gives feedback to me. So I think one place to start is how you got to this point of writing this book, but what led you?
What got me here was something mundane, which is I had regrets. And also, I had gotten to a point in my life. What was kind of startling is that, sort of one day I woke up and realized that I had some mileage on me. I'd always considered myself like very, I went, in my early days of working, I was always the youngest person in the room. And as I started, suddenly I looked up and I was like, oh my God, I am so not the youngest person in the room. In fact, I'm actually older than almost everybody here. And I realized I had mileage on me. And when I look back, there were some things that I wish I had done or wish I hadn't done. And I think the curious thing about that was that when I mentioned those things to other people, when I took the very tentative step of discussing my regrets with others, which I did with some apprehension, I got an incredible response. People leaned in. They wanted to talk about it. Now, as a therapist, you're probably not shocked that people want to talk about these things. But to me, as just a writer, I was like, whoa, this is interesting. I'm getting a very, very robust response, very different from what I had thought the response would be to even broaching the topic of regrets. And to make a long story longer, that took me down looking at some of the existing academic research on this topic and then doing a couple of research projects of my own, largely just to try to make sense of this misunderstood emotion.
I think people want to talk about it in the right setting, but they don't want to feel it. So it's sort of an interesting, yeah. I think that when regret shows up, we tend to emotionally avoid it. And one of the things you write about is sort of how people say, I have no regrets. That's sort of a common thing that people say. But what I find is that we have the twinge of regret, and we kind of want to not think about it, not feel it, not go there. But as soon as someone opens the door for you to start talking about it, it's kind of like, oh, wait, this is like the self-disclosure connection. I can share with you that I have some regrets. And
I agree. I agree with you. I think that's a good way to analyze it. I'll also see you and raise you just a little bit. One of the things that we know from the research on regret is that of course, that regret is, one of the most common emotions that human beings have. But it's also done right. It's actually beneficial, that we can actually harness it to learn and grow. And the thing is that people love the learning and growing part. They want that, but they don't like the fact that it comes with discomfort. So what they want is the learning and growing without the discomfort. And that is not the bargain that's on the table. Those two things are twinned. If you want the learning and growth, you have to have some of the discomfort, some of the pain, some of the unpleasantness.
I've done a little reconnaissance on you. One of the things that I do before I do a podcast is I read the book. I listen to everything that I can find. It's impossible to listen to everything about you. And then I've been taking your masterclass with my family.
Oh God. Okay.
I know. But I know your birthday's coming up, because I heard you're a July birthday. My husband is actually a July birthday, and he's turning 50.
Oh, wow.
And one of the things that happens when you turn 50 is you start to look at all of the relationships that have drifted, like, oh my gosh, my high school friends I haven't talked to. You look at your health, you look at, you just basically look at your life, and you're sitting in a big pile of regret. I'm curious for you, what were some of the regrets that came up that launched this work? And then we can talk a little bit about the science of it and what you found.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I mean, you make another really interesting point, which is that a lot of times what triggers these regrets, or maybe not what triggers the regrets, but what triggers are look backward, which often leads to regrets, are milestones. like your husband's 50th birthday. And for me, there was, one of the catalysts for me was a milestone. It wasn't a personal milestone. It was my eldest daughter graduated from college. And for me, that was kind of like this weird milestone. It's like, I couldn't even believe it. And that's what kind of sparked me to look back. And when I look back on my own regrets, there are a lot. Among the most persistent, I guess, or maybe not persistent, but among the most enervating are regrets about kindness, especially earlier in my life. I just don't think I was an especially kind person, and I can think of as many specific instances where I wasn't aggressively unkind. I don't have regrets about bullying, like many of the regrets that I captured. I had a lot of regrets in some of the research I did about people who have regrets about bullying other people. But what I had regrets were sort of unkindness by inaction. So that I was in situations where people were not being treated well, particularly situations where people were being excluded. And I saw it happen. I knew it was wrong, and I didn't do anything. And that has bugged me for 30 years, over 30 years. And so that's one of the big regrets that I had. The other thing is that I also feel like in many cases in my life, not always, I wasn't quite bold enough. That is, I could have taken a bigger shot. I was a little bit too circumscribed. So, I have those kinds of regrets. I have regrets about losing touch with people. I've done a pretty good job of dealing with that. That's an easier one for me to deal with. And I have regrets about, I have regrets sort of about conscientiousness and diligence too. Some.
What was the barrier then to being kind or being bold? Like, what was the thing that showed up that prevented you from doing it?
Well, so I think in both cases it was fear. It was in the case of sort of standing up and sort of when people were being mistreated, it was, I didn't want to be ostracized myself. I didn't want to be the spiky nail sticking up. I didn't have the guts to sort of put my neck on the line for something that was right. And I think the same thing is true with boldness. So maybe it was a fear of I don't know, rejection or failure or that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that concept of fear, like fear shows up and then you turn left when you really want to turn right, and you repeatedly turn left in your life, and all of a sudden you're moving in circles that you didn't want to be in.
Correct.
Yeah. What were some of the common themes that came out of the research? Well, maybe describe the research that you did and then some of the common themes.
So let me show my work and let you and explain how I got there. So I did two big pieces. So I did basically there are three research legs underneath all the arguments and concepts that I'm trying to push here. One of them is looking at about 50 or 60 years of research, existing research in social, not so much, I didn't look at a lot in clinical psychology, but a lot of research in social psychology and a lot in developmental psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science. Like, what does science tell us about this emotion? That's one thing. The second thing is that I did my own very large public opinion survey of the US population, where we put together a very, very large sample, 4,489 people, to try to model I think we very successfully modeled the demographics of the US, asking people a lot of questions about their attitudes on regret. That was designed to do sort of two main things. One is to try to figure out what people regretted, and then also to see if there were, what kinds of demographic differences there were in people's regrets. And unfortunately, what I found is that people regretted a lot of stuff. So it wasn't a clear answer to that. And also there were not that many demographic differences. So fortunately, I also did a third piece of research, which is a more qualitative piece of research, which was called the World Regret Survey, where I collected regrets from around the world. And at this point, we have a database of 21,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. And that proved to be fascinating. I mean, and revelatory, I think.
When you write the different vignettes of people's regrets that you're pulling from, and you hear everything from regrets about affairs to regrets about, not trying out for a job or,
exactly.
Like
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So what I got there was, and it began, I mean, just to, pull back the curtain a little bit in case your listeners are interested, it began largely as a as a storytelling tool. Like that, as I did it initially because I wanted to get stories of people's regrets to enliven the research. To my surprise, what happened were two things. Number one, the volume of responses I got was unbelievable. I mean, like, it's just stunning. I basically had I did like 2 tweets and 1 newsletter mention, and then I had to stop mentioning it because I didn't want to get overwhelmed. So the volume of it, but also it turned out to be that was a profoundly important research tool, because I read all these regret. I didn't read all 21,000. I read the first 15,000, and once you start reading them, I mean, I guess it's sort of like being a therapist. Once you start reading them, you start hearing the same language. You start literally sometimes seeing the exact same language, and certainly kind of hearing the same kind of music. And that made me think there was something else going on. And again, getting in the weeds here a little bit, the flaw, such as it was in the first survey, the quantitative survey, where I asked people for a regret and had them slotted into a category like career, education, romance, family, whatever. That kind of categorization was less meaningful than the categorization that I realized was underneath all of that when I actually read through these thousands upon thousands of regrets. That what matters in regret is not the domain of life that you're in, but something else, a hidden motivation, a hidden set of emotions, a hidden kind of architecture of aspiration. I don't know what to call it, but sort of just very, very like one layer beneath, there's something bigger going on that transcends the domains of life. And what I found is that around the world, with remarkable regularity, people seem to have the same 4 core regrets.
Okay, so spell them out for us. The 4.
So the 4 core regrets. 1, foundation regrets. If only I'd done the work. These are regrets that people have. The biggest single category in these are essentially, I spent too much and saved too little. So and now I don't have any money. It's small, but it doesn't have to be money. That's the thing. It's small decisions early in life that accumulate to terrible consequences later in life. It's not the kind of thing where it's like one instance destroys your life. Not at all. It's basically this accumulation of bad choices.
Yes, I often talk about my tanning beds in college as that one.
Okay, so
a lot of sun.
So that could be, and that one actually is and that's a good, interesting example, because there's a cumulative. You go to a tanning bed once, you're fine. Who cares?
Right.
But it's the accumulation of it all, and then that becomes something very difficult to undo. These foundation regrets are sometimes difficult to address, and it could be things like involving health. It could be things involving more than I expected. Regrets where people said, "I wish I had worked harder in school." So that's what foundation regrets are. Okay. So boldness regrets are the second category. Boldness regrets are, if only I'd taken the chance. And again, these are regrets. A lot of these regrets begin at a juncture in life where you can go this way or you can go that way. You talked about it, turning left and turning right. And that's a good, interesting metaphor for that. So in this case, you can play it safe, you can take the chance. And what I found is that much of the time, not all the time, but much of the time, when people don't take the chance, they ultimately regret it. And it doesn't matter the domain of life, as I sound like a broken record here, but this is really important. So these are people who have regrets about not asking somebody out on a date years ago, stunning number of those, regrets about not starting a business, regrets about not traveling, regrets about not speaking up. So basically, if only, you're at a juncture and people play it safe and then they regret it, because what they really wanted to do was stand up, speak up, do something.
Yeah.
Third category.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me pause you on boldness regrets. So I think this starts young, and I have 2 young boys that play baseball. And what I noticed is that when you're 6 or 7 and you play baseball, what they do is they put the ball on a tee, and then you walk up to it and you hit the ball, and you get to be a pretty good hitter, right? But then between like 7 and 8, something changes where someone throws the ball at you. And now what's changed about baseball is if you don't hit that ball, you get out, right? So the very first thing that I noticed my boys starting to do is stop swinging at the ball. And you stop swinging at the ball because fear. It's uncomfortable to get out in that short term, to not be bold, right? But then what would happen is I drive them home on the way back. And what does mom hear in the back of the car? I wish I swung at the ball.
Oh,
I can't believe I got out without swing. I just sat there and I watched 3 balls come in and I stood and held up my bat. So I think it's like early on, we start to take that short-term avoidance. I mean, this is very acty, like avoidance of that fear, avoidance of the pain. And then we sit in the long-term consequence of that, of not being bold, of not swinging. And we can map that onto like, not asking someone out for a date, not going to graduate school, whatever it is that we aren't bold around. But I see a lot of that in my therapy. And it seems like the boldness regrets, actually, unlike the foundation regrets, is something that we can start to do right here, right now. Like we can start being bold. I've been really in the business of being bold since from my 40s on, because I'm trying to make up for lost time.
I hear you. I mean, I think that's so I think they make a very good point. I think foundation regrets are difficult to undo because there's accumulation of forces. And, I mean, again, this is a little bit of a cliche, but there's this proverb, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So, so if you have these foundation regrets, you can't undo 20 years of bad health choices, but you can start today to make better health choices. So that's one thing there. Boldness regrets. I think the lesson of boldness regrets, I think, is to have a slight bias for action.
Yeah.
In basically every realm of life, not to be wild and like a massive risk taker in every domain, but to have a slight bias for action. And if you want to, bring a baseball metaphor to this, and I welcome baseball metaphors at any time of the day or night, is that if you're going to strike out swinging.
Right.
Don't strike out taking a pitch. Strike out swinging. And I think that part of it is also like, I wouldn't put I mean, I was my son was a baseball player. I was a baseball coach, not a good one. And, I think one of the things that, when you're talking about kids that age, I think what you have to do is you have to essentially celebrate striking out swinging. I think you have to say, oh my God, that was such a great final cut. You really went after that. Way to go, and not, say, oh, too bad you struck out. You'll get him next time. But actually say, what a great cut. You really went after that pitch. Way to go. Yeah. And just celebrate that kind of risk taking.
And then we can do that for ourselves. So it's all about behavioral reinforcement. What are you reinforcing in yourself? What are you reinforcing in others? And if you want to dial up your boldness, then you need to reinforce boldness, not reinforce outcome.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I agree with that completely. And I agree with that completely. And I think that one of the interesting things, it's another interesting point. One of the interesting things that I thought about these regrets as I collected them is that what really bugged people were not the outcomes. What bugged them was the moment where they didn't swing. Okay. Mm-hmm. So for instance, I have regrets about, let's go back to some of these romantic regrets of which there were many, where people say, oh, if only I had, said something to that person, or if only I had asked that person out on a date. Very few of the people who say that in the follow-up interviews were saying, oh my God, if I had asked him out on a date, we would have gotten married and we'd be living in this beautiful house and we'd have these 9 great kids and this idyllic life. They don't say that. They don't focus that much on the outcomes. What they focus on is the moment itself where they didn't step up. And that's what ultimately irks them.
Yeah. So there's these big, and we're going to get to I know there's 2 more. We're going to get to the 2 more, but I want to stay on boldness because this one is one that I work a lot with people in therapy around. And there's the big moments of being bold, but then there's the little moments. And so again, I've been steeping in regret in preparation for this episode. And last week I was in a yoga class and a teacher said, okay, if you want to, you can get into a balance pose here. He was trying to teach us side crow, which is like basically you're balancing your knees on one elbow and your feet are off the ground.
That sounds very difficult. I don't know anything about yoga. Yeah.
Okay. So your hands are on the ground. You're balancing both knees on one elbow and your feet are off the ground. You're crouched down like a.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's very challenging. so I looked over and there was this woman. I did this cardinal sin of like looking at the person next to you. You're not supposed to compare, right?
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
I looked over and there she was, a 55-year-old woman in like full on this amazing, crazy balance pose. And I had a twinge of regret. And the regret that I had in that moment was all the classes that I'd been at for the past 20 years where I hadn't tried to do that thing because I didn't want to fall down. And I told myself I wasn't strong enough. And I looked at her and I was like, there's no difference between this woman and me. The only difference is that for the past 20 years, she's been trying it. And now look at her. So I made it. So in that moment, I was like, okay, I'm going to pull a Daniel Pink here and I'm going to fall on my face in the service of trying this, because maybe when I'm 55, I'll be able to do that pose. But not even that, just for the sake of, I won't regret it when I'm 55 that I didn't try. So it's like almost like those bold moves that we don't do because we don't want to embarrass ourselves or we don't want to experience fear or all the emotions that we avoid in the discomfort of being bold.
I think that the key word in what you just said, which I think is powerful, is discomfort. I think it's discomfort. We spend too much of I think we need in some ways a reframing of discomfort. Discomfort is not something to be avoided. It's something, I don't want to sound glib here, but it's something to be sought. That in many ways, discomfort is a positive signal. We look at discomfort as a negative signal. We say discomfort, something's wrong, I need to escape. I think that what we need to do when we experience discomfort is say, oh, I'm feeling discomfort. Okay, I'm doing something right here.
Sometimes, if that discomfort is in the service of your values.
Good point.
I would say.
Good point.
Because
Good point.
I wouldn't
Good
say
point. I'm going
to seek out discomfort just for the sake of it.
I'm going to experience discomfort breaking into my neighbor's back door. You're right. So I agree with you. I agree with you. In the service of, I think it's well said. I think in the service of something that you value, in the service of your values. Yeah.
Right. So it's the value that's the guide, and discomfort is likely to come along the way as you're moving towards your value. It's actually you're more likely to experience discomfort.
If your value in the case of yoga is excellence, or your value is health, or your value is, I don't know, serenity, or whatever it is, that the path to any of those things is not a path of comfort. It's a path studded with discomfort. And I think what we have to realize is that when we pursue our values, that discomfort is a positive signal. It's not a negative signal.
Absolutely. So that leads to one of the other big regrets, which is around connection. And there's a lot of discomfort in connection and intimacy, and just maintaining relationships is uncomfortable. So what did you learn about connection regrets, this third type?
Well, connection regrets are another good example of this, which is connection regrets are about these relationships we have in our lives, and mostly not romantic relationships, but just the whole spectrum of relationships we have in our lives. And a lot of times these relationships come apart, and, they come apart in, at least as reported to me, in these pretty undramatic ways. They're not coming apart because of in most cases, because of some giant fight or some giant estrangement. They just kind of drift. And what happens is that somebody wants to reach out, but there's discomfort. And the discomfort comes in the form of awkwardness. They say, oh man, if I reach out to her right now, after having not talked to her for 8 years, it's going to be so awkward. And besides, she's not going to care. And so we don't. Because we just want to avoid that discomfort so profoundly. We want to race away from that awkwardness. So we wait a couple more years and we say, oh man, now it's super awkward because it's now 11 years since I talked to her, and it's going to be even more awkward, and she's not going to care. And I think that here we make a colossal error, or two colossal errors. One colossal error is that it's way less awkward than people think. It's way less awkward than people think. Our fears of awkwardness are often far in excess of the reality of the awkwardness that we feel. Second, the other side almost always cares. And so to me, again, if we want to derive a lesson from it, and it's similar to the lesson that we were talking about with boldness regrets, is to have a bias for action. And for me personally, you know what, I mean, I feel like now, having talked to all these people and done this research, that if I'm at a moment where I'm saying, oh, should I reach out to X, Y, or Z? If I've made it to that moment, the making it to the moment answers the question. Reach out.
Yeah.
Reach out.
Yeah. And it'll make your 50-year-old or your 60-year-old birthday a lot better if you have. Instead of going through your address list and being like, who do I invite to my party? Ooh, I can't invite them because I haven't talked to them in 10 years, but I really do care about them. You'll be like,
but for some of us, our 50th birthday is in the rearview mirror. So
I know. That's why I said 60th,
yeah.
because I know where you're headed in your birthday line. 70th, whatever it is. Maintaining
80th, 90th.
Yeah, of those relationships. So that's the drifting kind, like the relationships that we don't water, that just sort of, and then now we're like, so making that move of connection. But then there's the other kind, which is the relationships that are in a place of just like gridlock. You've had some kind of conflict, maybe you've even had estrangement.
Okay.
And that's another thing that I hear about in therapy, obviously, is like, I don't talk to my sister anymore ever since this thing happened. And oftentimes when you look at that thing, it's like, it wasn't that big of a thing, but we were so unable to resolve it. We both just kind of gave up on it. And now it feels impossible to find our way back again. What did you hear in that department in terms of regrets with estrangement?
I heard some of those. There was less estrangement than I would have thought. And the core estrangement or the most common estrangement that I heard, it was sort of heartbreaking. It was estrangement between parents and kids, basically parents and adult children. Mm-hmm. That kind of estrangement. And to me, again, it's easy to say from the outside without a horse in the race, and look at it outside. It's like, okay, guys, this is totally resolvable here. It's like, I almost like a certain case of, okay, guys, here we go. Let's get on a Zoom call. We'll get it together and we'll talk about this and we'll figure this out, because you're actually not that far apart. But it's easier for me to say with not having a stake in it and also looking at it from the outside. But what I found is that the estrangements, first of all, I think there's some estrangements that will remain estrangements, because I think that the gash is so deep that it's not reparable. But I think that's the rare case. I think in most cases you can bridge that gap. The problem is, as a layperson, there's probably a therapeutic answer to this. The problem, as I see it as a layperson, is that people fear in some ways, the ego damage of admitting anything that they did was wrong. They are risk averse about being the one to reach out, and they think of themselves as trustworthy, but the other side is untrustworthy.
Yeah. Well, it's that foundation of discomfort again in the relationships that matter most to you. So parent-child relationship is one of the relationships that matter most to us in life. It's also going to be the relationship that's most painful to you.
Right.
And so entering into that pain requires a tremendous amount of acceptance and willingness and clarity around what your values are to be able to do that. It's quite a challenge. Yeah.
Yep.
So connection regrets is a third one where there's a common theme. When my 9-year-old was in second grade, he woke me up in the middle of the night and he couldn't sleep. And I went in there and he said, "I just feel so guilty, Mom." And you hear your 9-year-old say you feel guilty. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what do you feel guilty about? He said, well, this little girl had given him a piece of paper in class. And the piece of paper said, "I like you. Do you like me?" And there was a little box that said yes, and a little box that said no. And he said, "I checked the no and I gave it back to her. And I feel so guilty because I didn't mean that I didn't like her. It's just that I didn't like her. And again, because I'm a therapist, what I didn't do was say, you shouldn't feel guilty about that. It's not a big deal. It's, what I said was, of course you feel guilty because you care. You're a caring kid. Otherwise you wouldn't feel guilty. There's a value underneath the feeling of guilt. We don't feel guilty unless we care, right?
Of course.
And then how can we act on that care? And how can we act towards repair? So what he ended up doing was he's like, well, first, can you call her moms? She's got 2 moms. And I was like, yeah, I can call her moms and, like, prepare them for this. But he wrote a little letter back that said, I'm sorry. It's not that I don't like you. I really do like you. It's just I don't like you. And he sent the letter back. But it's an example of using this kind of like, we have a connection regret. We would want to just avoid it and pull away and never see that girl again. But really what we can do is move towards it and use it as information to create the repair and
Exactly.
do the thing that needs to be done. And that's what gave him
Exactly.
relief. So he could sleep well the next night.
He's a much more emotionally advanced male than men 30 years his senior.
Well, I'll tell you, we did your exercise from the masterclass on perspective taking,
Okay.
where you write the E on your forehead. So everyone write an E on your forehead, right? Does the E face you so that you can read it, or face someone else that they can read it? That kid wrote it so that someone else could read it. And, I'm like, yeah, he's got powers and perspective taking that will do him well in life.
If he's not hobbled by guilt.
True. So I want to talk a bit about that, because that actually leads into the last one being moral regret.
Yeah,
And
moral regrets are moral regrets are the smallest category, but it's also in some ways the most complex. Moral regrets are, if only I'd done the right thing. And once again, you're at a juncture, you can do the right thing, you can do the wrong thing. People do the wrong thing, and most of us regret it, because I think most of us are moral, and most of us actually want to live by our values and feel crappy when we don't. And now, the thing about moral regrets is that we don't have a full consensus across the human population about what constitutes morality. So there's some things that some people would consider a moral breach and other people wouldn't. But there's also plenty of things where there is a consensus. And what came out most prominently here are regrets about bullying, lots of them. And then also I was shocked by how many regrets there were about bullying. And then I was also, maybe I'm naive, I was shocked about how many regrets there were about marital infidelity.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of a scattering of other kinds of regrets.
Mm-hmm. Well, moral emotions are social emotions, and they're about not being kicked out of your tribe. So depends on what your tribe says is going to kick you out or not, right? And that's very cultural and contextual. But the interesting thing about there's a whole line of research right now in clinical psychology on moral injury, and it's coming out of the VA. And I actually just came from a workshop on moral injury with some of the leaders in that. There's Lauren Borges is doing a lot of work in the area, and Robin Walzer. And what they looked at was veterans that were coming in and telling them these stories, these horrors of things like, I witnessed a rape. I tried to contact, someone at a higher level, and they told me I couldn't intervene. And now I'm harboring this guilt. And I've been harboring this guilt for years. And that's why I drink. And that's why I want to kill myself. I mean, veterans have super high suicide rates, right? And what they've been looking at in moral injury, and the intervention for moral injury, really maps on to what you write about in terms of regret, which is, it's not about trying to get them to feel better about what they did. It's actually making contact and being able to be present with the moral injury itself, looking at how they've been trying to avoid it, and look at the value underneath it, just like I did with my son. Like, what's the value underneath this? And use that with self-compassion,
right,
to guide you to live your life now. That there's wisdom in the experience of the moral pain. We don't have as many moral regrets, but the moral regrets are the ones that eat away at us.
There's no question about that. But you make another good point about how, you say, what is the value underneath? And I think that one of the things about regrets in general, moral regrets in particular, is that they excavate what's underneath. They reveal what's underneath. That is, they reveal what we value. So I think about it this way. Yesterday, I don't know how many decisions I made. I don't remember most of them, and I don't think any of them are going to bug me. Okay. So, but when I go back to these kindness regrets that I mentioned earlier, those things occurred 30 years ago, 35 years ago. Okay. The fact that they stick with me is a signal. It's excavating, revealing what I value. It suggests that I value kindness. And then so for the veterans you're talking about, the fact that these concerns are sticking with them is revelatory. What it's saying is like, okay, you value integrity, you value justice, you value fairness, whatever it happens to be. And so that's the other reason why we want to think about our regrets, not ignore them in this blithe, no regrets philosophy, and not wallow in them, but actually confront them, use them as signals, use them as information, use them as catalysts for behavior and understanding.
We shouldn't approach our regrets with "I have no regrets," but what is it that you're suggesting we should do?
Well,
instead?
we shouldn't say we have no regrets, because everybody has regrets. If you don't have regrets, it's a sign that you're 5 years old and your brain hasn't developed, or it's a sign that you might have brain damage, or it's a sign that you're a sociopath. So if you truly don't have regrets of any kind, that's a warning sign right there, because everybody has regrets. It's one of the most common emotions that we have. And I think that's really important. If there's any sort of mission underneath this book, it is that I want to try to normalize this emotion of regret, because it's normal, and it's ubiquitous. Now, what do we do with it? So I think it really begins with how we think about ourselves and our regret, how we look at things inward. So, when we talk to ourselves in the face of mistakes, we're brutal. We lacerate ourselves, and so the work on self-compassion, started by Kristen Neff 20 years ago, says, don't do that. Treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Don't treat yourself better than anybody else, but don't treat yourself worse than anybody else. So treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Recognize that your mistakes are part of the human condition, and also recognize that any mistake, any regret that you have is a moment in your life, not the full measure of our life. When negative things happen, when we make a mistake, we do something stupid, we're willing to take that isolated moment in a long life and say, that bad thing fully defines who I am. When we do something stupid, we take that one moment in our lives and say, this fully represents who I am. And that's a bad idea. So treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Recognize that mistakes are part of the human condition, and recognize it's a moment in your life, not the full measure of your life. And once we do that, I think that opens the way to make sense of a regret and then extracting a lesson from it.
Self-compassion, I think, is, it's central to healing a lot of the places that we're stuck in our life. If we start with self-compassion, then it opens up the door to then.
Yeah. And I think it's sometimes people get self-compassion wrong. They think of it as like fully exonerating yourself, or sort of happy talk, when it's not. It's basically, treating yourself with kindness rather than contempt. And again, the way I think about it, this is not in the book, but as I thought about it some more, is that basically what you hear from people is they feel obliged to treat themselves worse than they treat other people. So if you were to hear myself talk, I would never talk to anybody else the way that I talk to myself. And what self-compassion says is you're not treating yourself better than other people, but you're not treating yourself worse than other people. You're treating yourself with the same tenderness and care and kindness that you would treat somebody else. Not better, not worse, just the same as you would treat somebody else. Yeah. And again, I think that takes away some blockage and allows us to begin talking about our regret, writing about our regret, disclosing our regret, trying to make sense of it, and then drawing a lesson from it.
So that part that you just kind of went quickly through of disclosing and writing and drawing a lesson, I feel like you start with the self-compassion, and that part is the getting your hands in it and kind of working with it so that you can create something from it, right? So the self-disclosure gives you a little bit of perspective, taking a little bit of distance from it, letting other people in to see it. And there's a lot of relief in that.
Exactly. I think that disclosure, I think disclosure does two big things. Number one, it's an unburdening. And, as a therapist, I don't have to tell you that people just want to unburden themselves, that they're carrying around this weight, and they want to just remove the weight, even if it's temporarily removing the weight. But I also think there's something else going on here too, which is that is taking something that is abstract and making it concrete. And what I mean by that is that emotions tend to be very abstract. If I say to you squirrel, you can picture a squirrel. If I say to you gratitude or joy, it's like it's an abstract concept. And so emotions are abstract. That's what it makes positive emotions feel good. It makes negative, but it's also what makes negative emotions feel bad. And so the more we can take these negative emotions, whether it's regret or anything, and talk about it, write about it, what we do is a kind of a transmutation. We take this thing that is abstract, and by converting it into language, we make it concrete. And those concrete words are less fearsome. They're less fearsome. So what we're doing is we're going from abstract to concrete. That makes it from menacing to less menacing. And I think that itself is inherently good. And then what it does is it opens the way to make sense of it and draw a lesson from it.
To add a little bit to that, we're also exposing ourselves to something over and over and over again for an
Oh, that's interesting.
period of time.
Yeah.
And, when you expose yourself to something, you start to habituate more to it.
Right. And it destigmatizes it. It makes it, yeah. So that's a really good point too. I mean, I think what we're doing is we're trying to remove the menace of it.
Yeah.
That is, there's a kind of you can almost see it physically. It's like the regret is like looming over you. It's a monster. It's this multi-tentacled thing that is threatening you, and it's a menace, and it's fearsome. And by constant repeat, okay, all right, yeah, I've seen you monster before, all right, whatever. You habituate to it. But then what you also do is you say is you take this abstraction and you make it concrete. And I think that something that is concrete is way less fearsome than something that is abstract.
Yeah, when you look in the closet and see what's actually in there versus just imagining what's in there, it's easier.
Exactly.
So the first step is bringing the kindness, common humanity, mindfulness, self-compassion to the regret. The second step is to disclose, write about it, start to look at it, concretize it. And then, there's this third part of it was actually use it for something. Make this useful to you.
Totally. Yeah. And that's essential. That is essential. So if I sort of treat myself with kindness rather than contempt, and that I disclose it to make sense of it, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. What you need to do is you need to extract a lesson from it that you apply to your future behavior. And one of the things that we know, and it's sort of in some ways, it's why people, it's a reason people go to therapy, is that we are terrible at solving our own problems because we're too close to it. We're too enmeshed in the details. So what you want to have some distance from it. And there are various techniques of self-distancing that you can use. You can ask yourself, what would I tell my best friend to do? You can ask yourself, what would the me of 10 years from now want me to do right now? And the more we get a distance from our immediate problems, the more we sort of zoom out, go away from the gory details toward a big picture. I mean, the metaphor that I use is, we're too often a scuba diver in our regret. And what we want to be is we want to be an oceanographer. We want to actually look out like that at our regret. We can draw a lesson from it. And then, in some ways apply the lesson next time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That sort of take the moment to say, am I going to regret this? Or what would be the move that would be the move I'd regret versus the move that would be my values move? Yeah. Wonderful. If people want to participate in your survey, is it still open? You said you closed it off because you were. No,
I stopped publicizing it. I didn't take it down. We still have regrets coming in every single day. So you can go to worldregretsurvey.com. We have when the back end code is working, we have a groovy interactive map where you can click on a country or you can click on a state or province and see the last 8 regrets that have come in from that place.
That's awesome. So, and it'll be your first step in that self-disclosure that you're already on your way if you're writing it out and submitting it.
I think the key thing to remember here is that everybody has regrets. Every functioning human being has regrets. And so the question isn't whether you have regrets or not. It's really what you do with them. And I don't think that we've been taught well enough how to deal with regrets or negative emotions in general, for that matter. So we have this tendency to ignore them and say, I don't have any regrets. I never look backward. I'm always positive. That's a bad idea. Or because we're ill-equipped to deal with them, we end up getting captured by them. We wallow in them. We ruminate on them. That's a bad idea too. I think what we want to do is confront our regrets, think about them, we use them as clues. And when we do that, this is a powerfully transformative emotion.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you, Daniel Pink, for being on the show. And
thanks for having me. Very therapeutic.
Very therapeutic. Yeah.